So the topic of today's webinar is the R Markdown package. My name's Garrett, as Bill said. If you'd like to follow me on Twitter, my handle's there, and I only tweet things related to learning R and R's packages pretty much consistently. I work for R Studio, where I develop their educational content, and some things that I've developed with R Studio, or I should say R Studio has developed with me and second companies, are the hands-on programming with R book, the Introduction to Data Science with R video, both with O'Reilly, and a course of interactive tutorials for DataCamp. And the reason I bring these up is if you are new to R as well as R Markdown and you're looking for a place to start or learn about the R language, or you know people on your team who need to ramp up on R, I recommend all three of these resources. We spend a lot of time thinking about the best ways to teach R, and this is what we've come up with so far. However, educating in R is a continuing mission at R Studio, especially for myself. Which brings us to today, where I'd like to tell you about the R Markdown package, which is an R package that's designed to help you do two things. First, report your research, and second, to do your research in a reproducible way, a reproducible fashion. If you think about how a person who doesn't use R Markdown might reproduce the results that they generate with R, you can imagine some sort of workflow where they analyze data using R or perhaps another language. This will help them make their graphs, their tables, their figures, the numbers that come out of their model, the things that they want to report to their clients, their colleagues, and perhaps their bosses. If they want to give those things to their clients, colleagues, and bosses, they probably invoke another type of software like Microsoft Word or some LaTeX for generating PDFs. They type up a report that explains what they did and their results, and they copy and paste into that report the figures, the tables that they've generated. If they want to reproduce this research, they have to go back and find the code they used in R to recreate their analysis. That's not so hard for you if you're the person who ran that code, but the person who gets your report might not have access to that code to recreate your research. And if you do recreate your research, perhaps on a new or updated data set, the report that you made last time will likely become out of date. And you'd like to update it to have the most up-to-date reports, the most up-to-date figures, the most up-to-date information that your clients would like. So this sort of bifurcated workflow where you analyze in one language and you report in a second language is a bit clunky. This copy and paste step is really hard to automate. It's normally something you have to do manually. And it's something that's very easy to forget to do or to not spend the time doing when you go back into your research and create new results. The other thing that makes it clunky is the people who get the end product won't necessarily have the insights they need to reproduce your research, which we're finding in the world of data science is a very important characteristic of valuable research. So R Markdown is an attempt to do better at this. With R Markdown, you generate your reports completely from inside of R. You've always been able to save your R code into an R script, which you could use later, but R Markdown provides a new format that's a tweak on the R script. Inside of the R script, you have both your code and also narration, text that you write with the Markdown formatting language. A very simple way to format text. Basically, you add plain English into your R scripts. When you put these things together, you have what's called a .rmd file. That stands for R Markdown. And the .rmd file is a very useful tool for reproducible research. It has all the code that you need to recreate your research. So right there, this artifact you could use to reproduce your results. But it also has the narration that explains the code. This is an example of literate programming, but it's something you could pass on to anyone who wouldn't perhaps be able to interpret your code or your results, someone who's not trained in data science. You can explain what the results mean right here in the R Markdown document. This document itself is written in plain text, and it doesn't look that pretty. I mean, it might look similar to an email you send, but normally when you reproduce results and pass them on to someone else, you take some pride in the format and the style of those results. And so with R Markdown, you could take your R Markdown report and use it to quickly generate a variety of output reports. You can make an HTML report, a PDF report, Microsoft Word report, or even slideshows straight from your R Markdown file, which contains all the code used to make your report. Your code may or may not appear in the final output, that's up to you, but the final output will look like any HTML document or any PDF document or any Microsoft Word document that you make. You could style it in the same way you style those things, so you can make it look very nice. Okay, so that's just sort of like the theoretical workflow of R Markdown. There's one last aspect of this I'll cover, and then we'll jump into what R Markdown looks like in practice. If you make your R Markdown report and your data changes, you get a new week's worth of data in, and you want to regenerate your report to reflect that new data, all you have to do is go back to your .rmd file and then regenerate your report. At the time you generate the finished output, R will rerun all of the code in the report on the data as it is at that moment in time. And so your final polished report will reflect the most up-to-date information. Like I said, that's how it works in theory. Let's take a look at how it works in practice. I'm going to open up the RStudio IDE. It looks like this. It's a free program for using R. You'll recognize the R console window over here. And we've done a lot of work in the RStudio IDE to integrate R Markdown into the IDE. In fact, you could think of the RStudio IDE as an R Markdown text editor, among other things. If you want to write an R Markdown file in RStudio, first go to File, New File, and instead of selecting RScript, select R Markdown. It's the second option. RStudio will pop up a window that asks you, well, what do you want to do with this file in the long run? It doesn't really matter what you say here. I'll show you why. So we'll just click through. What RStudio does is it takes the information that you provide in the pop-up window and it uses that information to fill your R Markdown file with a template. So this is the template we get for just clicking through, that when we click through, we let it go with HTML document, whatever. The template tells us a little bit about how to make an HTML document with R Markdown. If we had clicked a different option in the pop-up window, the template would speak to something else. At the end of the day, the idea is that you just erase everything in the template and you write your own document. But for now, let's take a look at the template, because this is a viable R Markdown document and we can learn from it. This is what an R Markdown document looks like in its raw form. See, it's plain text. You'll notice that this one starts with the YAML header. That's a section of key value pairs. And these pairs contain metadata that R Markdown uses when it renders this file into a report. You'll also notice lots of English in the report. This is just plain text. There's some lightweight markup going on in the text. For example, these brackets around this seems to indicate that this should be a live web link. We have some asterisks around the word knit, which will have an effect that we'll see. And then the other thing besides plain English in this report is recognizable R code. The R code appears separated from the rest of the text in these chunks, which RStudio highlights in gray, so they're easy to see. And this idea of combining English and R code in the same file is what R Markdown is all about. After you write a file, you set it up like this, then you can come up here and click the knit button in the IDE. Save your file. Save it there. And R Markdown will use the information in the .rmd file to create, in this case, an HTML output. You see this output has the same text that's in the original RMD file. It looks a little nicer. If we go to our files pane, we can see that both our RMD files now saved along with the output we generated. So we can take that HTML file and send it to our web server, wherever we want to have it appear. Go back to the preview, we could compare. See that putting these asterisks around knit made knit bold, and this is in fact a live web link. And then perhaps the more interesting thing is what happens if you look at the R code that was in the RMD file. R Markdown runs the code when it generates the report, and it appends into the report the output of the code. So the code over here is pretty simple, but this is what it returns, and now we see it in our report. The next block of code returns a plot, and we now have the plot in our report as a figure. You also notice you can customize how R Markdown uses the code. Here we see the actual code in our report, and here the code's hidden and just the results are put into the report. I'll talk about more of that in a minute. The last thing I want to show you, well, there's actually two other things I'll show you about this report, is we don't have to generate a final report. All our R code's in here, and if we just wanted to rerun our R code, we could go to any of these R code chunks. We could certainly copy and paste the code into the console, or we could just click the play button at the side of the code chunk. And what RStudio will do is it'll run that code in the console, so it's very easy to rerun code here. And if you wanted to rerun all of the code in the report, you just go to Run, the drop-down menu next to Run, and click Run All. Now the code in this report is very trivial, it doesn't do anything, but if this was a unified analysis that you spent time generating code in a logical sequence, clicking Run All would reproduce your research. As long as your R session has access to the data that you're using the first time around, this would reproduce your research. And then the other thing I said I'd mention is, if we go back to your CR report, we have a publish button inside of our studio. And if you like your report and you want to publish it, you can click publish. And you could select where you want to publish it at. The moment I'm just going to talk about RPubs, which is a website that RStudio has created. You can sign up for a free account. You could put any document you want. Let's see, what's today, the 12th? Here, and it's an online pasty site. So now people can go to this URL, see the report that you made in RStudio. It exists on the internet. There's no security here. This is just, hard to find, but it's out there. So be careful what you put up here. And people could leave comments and you can share with them. So it's a pasty site for your R Markdown publications. There are other ways that are coming where you could share your R Markdown documents, but the idea is it's going to be very easy to publish your R Markdown work through the RStudio IDE. So after you create it, you can publish it. Now that's a pretty trivial example, and that's all I want to show with the template. What I've done is I've prepared something a little more naturalistic for us to look at. All of the code that I'm going through today, we will make available in the next 48 hours. So we could just pay attention to what's here, and you could have access to this later if that's what you want. I put this script together here. It does a little bit with stock prices. If I've spoken at a webinar internally at your company, you may recognize some of this. But I like working with stock prices because no matter what your background is, they're pretty easy to understand. We could take a look at what this code actually does. This is just an R script. It loads a few R libraries, so that's familiar. And then what these libraries do is they collect stock information. In this case, we'll look at Google's stock price. My apologies if anyone online is from Google. You're just a very popular company. Then the code, using the prices, calculates whether the price of Google stock went up or down yesterday. And if the stock went up, in that case, this move variable here would be greater than 0. This line of code will return buy, and if it went down, it'll return sell. So Google had a good day yesterday, so this code here is returning buy. It's very simple, but what we're looking at here is a stock picking algorithm. It's saying, well, did the stock go up yesterday? If so, I'm going to buy it. If it went down, I'll sell it. I don't recommend anyone invest based on that algorithm, but you can see how it works. Next piece of code makes a graph. Here's the price history of Google. And the last piece of code shows us a little bit of the raw data we're working with. We can see it in terminal. So if your job was to be a financial analyst, this might be the sort of thing that you do many times on a daily basis. You download some data about stock, you decide whether to buy or sell, you look at some graphs, and you look at some raw data. What we're going to do is we're going to put this code into an R Markdown report to get a feel for how it feels to write R Markdown reports and what all you can do with an R Markdown report. The first thing we want to do is add the narration that sort of sets the structure for our report. Go back to the slides for just a second. Okay. So here's the things we looked at in the demo. The narration that you add to an R Markdown report, you go add in a specific language, a language called Markdown. This language was designed to be very easy to use. It was originally intended to be an alternative to HTML, and because of this, you could learn it probably in 5 minutes, maybe in 10 minutes. We're certainly going to make an attempt at learning it today, right now. If you look at these two examples here, the one on the left shows what raw Markdown looks like. You could read this, it's human-friendly. There are some symbols in there, like that hashtag at the beginning. If we look at the example on the right, we get a feel for what those symbols do. If you put a hashtag in front of a line of text with Markdown, then that text is eventually rendered into HTML, or in our case, HTML, PDF, Microsoft Word, whatever our Markdown renders into. The hashtag line will become a header. Regular text will be regular text, and then you can see we can make bulleted lists, and we can do things like have italics and bold and whatnot. Let's go over to RStudio IDE. If you wanted to write something, well, first let's create a new R Markdown file. Erase that stuff. If you wanted to write something in Markdown, but you didn't really remember how to use Markdown, you could go to the Help menu of the RStudio IDE, and there's a Markdown quick reference that we've included in the IDE. When you open it up, it opens in the Help tab, and it gives you examples of how to create different types of formatted text with Markdown. And the entire language is documented here. You can see how much that involves. I mean, there's only like 24 cues here to memorize. And you don't even have to memorize them and use them. You could always just open this up and and do it here. So if I wanted to write a report for this stock code, I might give it a header. We're talking about Google stock. The stock ticker for Google is Goog, so I'll make that the title of the report, I guess. I could write some text. For example, go stock price. Let's make some italic text, which you could do in two ways. You could put asterisks around. A single set of asterisks makes italic. A double set makes bold. Or instead of asterisks, you can use underscores. They both do the same thing. Let's make a bulleted list. Yes, Google is popular. Next item will say Google has a funny name. And the last item will say if you don't know who Google is, you can Google it. All right. And let's make this a helpful web link. If we come over here, we can see that there's ways to create web links inside our text. We saw one earlier, but this is a more mature way. This lets us make any line of text a web link, and then we can say where we want that web link to go. In this case, I think google.com would be appropriate. All right, so we started writing some R Markdown. There's more things we could do in here. One of the most interesting things to me is you could put equations into your documents. Let's add an equation. The way you do that is you either put a pair of dollar signs around your equation, or a double dot pair if you want it to be an equation block centered in its own line of text. Inside of the dollar signs, you write LaTeX math equation syntax. LaTeX is a program originally designed to make PDFs. It does very well, makes very beautiful equations, so it's used widely in math and sciences, and it's very easy to Google. So here's an equation. This is LaTeX syntax for making some superscript. LaTeX is spelled like latex. So if you are going to Google this, I recommend that you also include the terms latex math symbols. So if you just Google latex, I'm not sure what would come up, but it could be worrisome. All right. We've written some Markdown. Let's replace other top. You can see what this looks like. So here's the Markdown. We see our formatting has been applied. We have a header. We have italicized text. We have a live web link, which would go to Google, and we have our equation. This is how the equation is rendered. Now, this isn't the text we're going to use. I've actually made a more natural report. It's called stocktext.rmd. Let's knit this one. Here we go. So, we have some Google history here. We're going to talk about the graph we're going to make, how we made it. I've used the equations to make a description of the algorithm the code implements, and I've even talked about some raw data that we'll put in this report. This report has all the text I really want to appear in the report. It's just missing the R code, which will generate the results I want to appear in the report. So going back to our Markdown, if all this Markdown seems new to you, it might not be as new as you think. Many popular websites use Markdown, and there's a good chance you've been using it already and you don't realize it, because it's very close to plain English. Most of what you write is plain English. You can find the quick reference from the help menu. And then just a quick tour of the most important syntax pieces. You create multiple level headers by adding multiple hashtags in front of the text. You could create italics and bold, and code would be with 2 backticks. If you want to add a paragraph, you need to either put a blank line between paragraphs or have 2 spaces at the end of the line before you start your paragraph. I don't like this 2-space thing because it's invisible to my eye. It's so easy to just have a blank line between each paragraph, and I recommend that you do that. You create bulleted lists. You can also create numbered lists just by using numbers with a period after them. We made a hyperlink. We made an equation. Make an equation block. Then you could add images to a Markdown file using syntax similar to the hyperlink, except you put an exclamation before the hyperlink, and you don't need any link text in the brackets there. What you do need is to have the image exist alongside your R Markdown file, and the link to the image, you could use a URL, but if you're using an image that exists alongside your file, the link should be the file path to that image. One helpful thing that we'll come back to multiple times today that you should consider using if you work with R Markdown is the R Markdown reference guide. It's on the RStudio cheat sheet page. It's a little more than a cheat sheet because it's about 5 pages of helpful tips for R Markdown. The first page describes the Markdown language and it's visual, so it's very easy to see what you need to do to produce the effect you have in mind. The next page goes into how to add code to your R Markdown document. And that's what we're going to look at right now. So, let's look at code. If you've used the knitter package before, this is an older package for adding code to documents with R. R Markdown uses the same syntax. In fact, it calls the knitter package, and one of the primary authors of the R Markdown package is UAZ, who made the knitter package. With knitter, there's 2 ways to add code to a document, and these are the 2 ways that Markdown uses. You could add a chunk of code with this syntax here. You separate the code chunk with 3 backticks on either side, so R knows when the code chunk starts and when it finishes. And after the first set of backticks, you put a pair of braces with at least the letter R in it. This syntax R will recognize as an R Markdown code chunk. You can also add code to a line of text using the inline syntax. In that case, use 2 backticks on either side of the code and the letter R after the first backtick. Let's demonstrate these in the document we've been developing. So, for example, here we have some text. I'll get rid of that whole document. We have some code we want to put in there. Let's take some of this code and add it to our document as a chunk of our code. This code, the part I copied, it just sets up the analysis we're going to do, so I don't really need to see the results later, but I do need to put it near the top of the file to set up the file. So I'll make it the very first thing in the file. I could type out, the syntax for making a code chunk, and then copy and paste the things in here. But there's actually an easier way to do it if you just go to, there we go, insert new chunk. Some of our features are changing in the development version. So if you click this button to insert a chunk, if you're using an older version of RStudio, you'll see a menu like Run, but it says Chunks, and the first option is Insert Chunk. It inserts that syntax for you, so you don't have to memorize it. We could add our code into the chunk. I'm just using copy and paste. Once our code's there, if we don't like to look at it, we could use RStudio's collapse feature to just collapse it so we don't have to see it. It's all still there. Let's see what other chunk code we have in here. Right here, we have some code that's designed to be used in line. This piece of code is going to return text. It's going to return either buy or sell. When you use the inline syntax in R Markdown, what you will get is, well, let's take a look at it. First, let's add this code in line. If we want to add it in line, we have to use this syntax. As far as I know, there's no way to insert that for us. You have to remember to use 2 backticks with the R behind it. Anything you put between those 2 backticks now, after the R, will be treated as R code, so we'll paste our code in there. Whenever you use inline code, R Markdown will run the code, but not put the code in your document. It will only put the output of the code. Here, that output will either be buy or sell. We don't know which one it is. If we looked up what the price did yesterday, stored in this move variable, we would know. We do know it's going to say buy now because we already looked at this. But if we were running this on a different stock and the price went down yesterday, it would say sell. We wouldn't have to keep track of what's the proper word to put in here because R is going to do that for us. Let's sniff this document so far. So here we have our libraries being loaded, our price data being fetched, our move variable being created, and then here the inline code has been rendered like this. It returned the word buy, so R Markdown put buy right into the text as if we had written buy ourselves. It also applies to that output buy any text formatting that this line of code is subject to. In this case, it's a second level header, so buy is printed as a second level header. We could repeat the effect down here. Google will blank in price during the next trading period. This time, I'll let R decide that for us. Instead of having to say buy or sell, I'll have it say increase or decrease. Now this question mark will be replaced, in this case, with increase. And once again, anyone who read this document would not be able to tell that we used R code to generate that word of text. We could use R code to generate whole sentences or paragraphs. At the end of the day, it's going to look like we typed that text from scratch. This is very exciting to me because it means you could use R to programmatically finish your report, to make sure your report is always precise and accurate. And your readers won't know that you did that ahead of time. They'll think you gave that report personal attention. So that's efficient. Right. Let's just port over the rest of this code real fast. I want to make a chart here. That's what this code does. Put that over here under, where I talk about the price history. Insert my code, put the chart there, that's fine. And then down here I want to put the raw data in. And this shows just a bit of the raw data. Guess I should pause whatever's going on here. Now if I run the report, all that code has been inserted into the report. But our report isn't very readable because we have code showing up in places where it's really just distracting. I just want to see the raw data there. Normally when you put a figure in here, you don't want to see the code that makes the figure, you just want to see the figure. And I definitely don't need to see all these messages about loading libraries and whatnot. In fact, the end user in my report probably doesn't really care that I load these libraries. So let's look at how we could tell R Markdown how to remove or at least use the code that we give it in different ways. Okay. After the R in the braces at the top of a code chunk, you can insert options that tell R Markdown how to treat the code in that chunk. These options don't work for inline code, but they will work for any code chunk that you make. The most popular option is probably echo equals false. This tells R Markdown to return the results of the code, but not to return the code itself. Don't echo the code back into the report. This is normally what you want to do when you want to put a figure into your report. You'd add echo equals false. You'll see the figure, but you won't see the code that made it. If you're interested in that code, you can always look it back up in the .rmd file. Eval equals false does something analogous to that. You will see the actual code in your report, but R Markdown will not run the code. So if your code takes a lot of time to run, it's a great idea to put eval equals false in front of it. You won't waste any time running the code. Now the results of the code won't be available in your analysis, so use this where it's appropriate. Fig width, fig height are ways that you could customize the width and height of the figures that you insert into your document. Message is a way to tell R Markdown not to print out any messages that are generated by the code. So R can generate messages, helpful things that the author thought you'd like to know. You could also generate warnings. If you don't want the warnings to appear in your report, just add the option warning equals false to your code chunk. And then one of the most interesting options to me, we're not going to use it today, but is the engine option. R Markdown is designed to help you report analysis done with R, but if you can also write in Python or SAS or a variety of other languages, you can add a code chunk to your R Markdown document that uses that language, make sure the code in the code chunk is written in that language, and then tell R Markdown that the chunk contains that code with the engine option. So this chunk right here contains Python code, and engine equals Python tells R Markdown to run this code with the Python interpreter. R Markdown does that, and the results we get are the results you get from Python. Like I said, you could use several different languages to get this effect. Here's all the ones that are currently supported. You could write an engine to support other languages if you really want another language involved, but you can see there are some popular languages here. The only trick is your computer needs to be able to run this language code outside of R Markdown before it will work inside of R Markdown. What that means is if you want to run some SAS code, you're going to need to have SAS installed on your computer with a valid license before your SAS code will run inside of R Markdown. So some logistics about R Markdown documents. If you add multiple code chunks into your document, you could just picture R Markdown taking all those code chunks in order, separating them from the text, and then running them as if they were an R script. R Markdown will run them all in a fresh R session. So if they rely on functions or datasets that exist in the library, then within your R Markdown document, you need to load that library. This idea of running the code in your document in a fresh session is important because you wouldn't want to run an R Markdown document and have it overwrite the objects that you have in your working directory or not your working directory, your working environment. You wouldn't run an R Markdown document and have it overwrite what you've been working on at the console all day long. So R Markdown runs in a fresh R session. As a side effect, you need to load all your data sets in your document. You need to load all your libraries and so on. For example, if I just ran qplot, I get this message. This is the message you get whenever you try to run a function whose library hasn't been loaded. And the way to fix it would be to add library ggplot2, that's where qplot comes from, either in this code chunk or in a code chunk that appears before this code chunk. The second logistical issue with adding code chunks in our Markdown document is objects made in one code chunk will be available to code in the later code chunks. So R Markdown runs your code chunks in order. It runs them all in the same session. It is a different session than your command line, but the code chunks are run in the same session. So what you make in one code chunk will be available later. If we go back to the reference guide, we could see that there are many different, these are all different code chunk options that you could use in your document to customize your R code. There's more than just what we went over. I just went over the most interesting ones. You could use RStudio's tab completion to kind of get a sense of what's involved. If you hit tab inside the braces, RStudio will show you all the different code chunk options you could choose from. You can see there's quite a few I didn't cover, but there are some that we should use in this document. So let's make message equals false so we don't see the messages this code produces, all this stuff over here. Let's also make echo equal false so we don't see the code itself, because this is just setting things up. If you want to have two options in the same code chunk, put a comma between them. Equals false. Down here, this is a chart, so let's also add echo equals false here. And then let's see, for this, I'm going to add echo equals false as well. Now when I knit this document this time, the document will be much tidier. It looks like a report, and we only see the things that we really need to see. All the code's in here, so we can still reproduce the report. It's just how it's displayed at the end is what's been polished. Another very important aspect of R Markdown that we haven't really examined yet is R Markdown is designed to help you create more than just HTML documents. You can create PDF documents, Word documents, you can even create slideshows. And doing it is actually fairly simple. Right here we've been clicking at HTML to make our HTML documents, but you could take any R Markdown document and make it something else. There's a drop-down menu. If I want to make this a PDF, I'll click Knit PDF. R Markdown will use the distribution of LaTeX that's installed on my computer, the program for making PDFs, to make a PDF. So here's how that content looks as a PDF. Same content, but now it's been formatted for a PDF. This would look very good if I printed it out. Could make a Microsoft Word document. Here's what the content looks like as a Microsoft Word document. Now I could pass this on to my office mates who prefer to use Microsoft programs. They might not realize I made it with something else. And then you can also make slideshows. By default, R Markdown just gives you the options to make these three things. But if you wanted to make a slideshow, you could do that manually, or you could set any of these options manually using the output field in the YAML header at the start of your document. This is the default format that your report will generate in. Right now it's that Word document. I could change it back to HTML by changing this to HTML. If I save it, RStudio will recognize the change and make the default HTML. To make a slideshow, you just need to save this in a slideshow format. And there are three of them. You can make IO slides presentation. Now, if I knit this, IO slides is an HTML-based presentation format. There's also Slidey and other HTML-based and Beamer PDF-based. All these make slideshows. When I click this, I get a slideshow that anyone with a web browser can see. The R Markdown naturally divides up the content into slides based on where the headers appear in the content. So here we see a report. So if I had to on the fly present this in front of an audience, it's very simple to turn my report into a slideshow. If I don't like HTML-based slideshows, well, then I can make Beamer slides using LaTeX. The Beamer slideshow looks like this. Okay. There's some more in the slides about how you could customize this sort of thing. I don't think I'm going to really go through it, but here's all your different options that you could set in the default YAML. And if you want to make slides, they'll be divided up based on the headers, or those 3 asterisks would put a horizontal line into a HTML document. In the slideshow, they just divide into a new slide. You can also create bullets and slideshows with these things here. The greater than before the bullet creates a bullet that appears incrementally. This is what I do want to spend some time on. So let's go back to our document. We've created a document that does a simple analysis on a simple thing, a stock price. And if we like this analysis, there are many other stocks out there that we might want to apply it to. And we could copy and paste this document and change Google to something like Amazon, but copy and pasting is what we want to get away from. It's easier and more efficient to actually add some parameters to make this whole document parameterized. Before we do that, go back to an HTML document. This is looking up Google stock prices only because I passed the Google symbol in right here. If I change this to something like Amazon, their stock symbol looks like this, then it would look up Amazon prices. Of course, if I did that, it would still tell everyone to look up Google prices, so that'd be a bit confusing. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to set up a parameter that controls which stock prices get looked up and also what text gets printed in the report. The way to parameterize an R Markdown report is to add a params field to your report in the YAML header, and then underneath the params, add as many values as you want to appear in your report. Here I'm going to create a value named symbol. You can name it whatever you like. And I'm going to set it to, in this case, let's look at Amazon. So this value will be this string here, AMZN. If I want my R code to use that value, then I use this syntax. Params is a list. It has as many elements as I create under params here. I only create one named symbol. So this will look up the symbol element of params, which is AMZN. If I want the text in my report to also reflect whatever that text is in the symbol parameter, then I'll just use my inline R code syntax to replace every instance of Goog. Now when I knit this report, symbol set at AMZN, so let's go look up Amazon stock as a different price history, you'll notice. And up here it says Amazon in these places, because each time it gets a param symbol, it's just go look up what's there. So that's really useful. Every time I change that symbol, I can make a new report. But you probably don't want to have to open the report to change the symbol, which is fine, because you could render your R Markdown reports from the command line. And you could change any parameters associated with reports when you do that. The way you render a report from the command line is with the function render, which comes in the R Markdown package. You run it by giving it the name of a report. So here ours is stocktext.rmd. If you wanted to, you could change the output format of the report right here. So output format, instead of making HTML document, I could set this to Word document. But the most interesting thing is if you wanted to pass parameters to it, you could set the params list right here as a params argument. It should be a list. My list only has one element symbol. And this time, let's look up Facebook. Now when I run this, R Markdown renders a file. If you render the file at the command line, RStudio doesn't automatically open a preview. But if you look in your files pane, you can see the file there. You can open a web browser. Oh. Well, yeah, I guess I made a Word file. So look at the docx file. Let's go open pages for me. We see that our docx file is using Facebook, our new parameter, as a new price history, and it's a new format. So why is this special? Why should you care about this? If you do the same thing every week, then it's very easy to just run render with your, that week's data. You can apply the report and the analysis embedded in the report on that week's data and just automatically have an up-to-date report. Or if you look at different regions or different states or different drugs or different people with different genomes, and you need to create the same report on all the different cases individually, you could just set up a for loop that calls the render function and feeds into it the name of the data set or the person or the genome or the stock or the region that report should generate. By the time the for loop's finished running, you'll have several different reports, each keyed into a different region or whatnot. So that's very efficient workflow. The last thing about params is if you set up this parameter list here, when you want to generate your report in the GUI fashion, you could always click knit with parameters. And R Markdown will look at your document, the metadata, and see what parameters you have. And right here you could type in which parameters you want the report to use. Let's look up Goldman Sachs. Now when I knit it, go get Goldman Sachs. They had a rough day yesterday, so the algorithm says so. Let's go back to the slides and wind this up. We looked at these render elements. So the take-home message I want you to leave with is that R Markdown is a way to create reproducible research. It's better than copy and pasting code from one place to another place. It's an automated way to write reports straight from your research, right from your code. The output format of R Markdown is very flexible. You could make HTML documents if you work online. You can make PDF documents if you want to print something else in a very nice format. If your work environment prefers the Microsoft Office suite, you can make Word documents. And if you're given a presentation, you can make a slideshow. In fact, you can make 3 varieties of slideshows. I didn't have time to show you this. Well, I'll show you this after this list. You could reuse style code. But in my mind, the most fascinating thing is you could parameterize your reports. And since your reports reproduce your entire analysis, that means that you could use R Markdown as a method or unit for parameterizing an entire analysis. You do it once and you save it, and then you could rerun your analysis on different parameters, different data sets, whatever you like, very quickly, and output the results in a very professional fashion. Now let's look at this last one, from template, the penultimate bullet up here. Let's see. I have some templates set up, so I can show you an example of this. If you go to a new file, R Markdown, one of your options here, instead of filling your file with a generic template that tells you a little bit about R Markdown, you could fill it with a template that's designed to do something helpful. For example, this first template here, Journal Statistical Software, it's an R Markdown file, but this time the template is set up with information that's primarily style information in my YAML header here. And some text here that I might want to reuse that would help me create a submission to the Journal of Statistical Software. I could, add all the interesting academic article I want in there, and when I knit it, I could rely on all this information that the document began with. That information, in this case, will apply the styling that this journal requires before you send any submissions there. So here I have, the journal's image and its header, and I'm using the fonts that they require and whatnot. If I was working for a company that used theming or a project that used a certain theme, I would take the time to set up a template that has all of this, save it, and then every time I make a document with that project, I'll just reuse the template to immediately have all of the theme information on my document, and I can focus on the text that I want to appear in the document. Okay. Now, some of these things here, like that one especially, I didn't have a chance to tell you enough about how you could reproduce it yourself. We just demoed it. But it's very easy to teach yourself R Markdown. You have the reference guide. At the same link, there's also a cheat sheet, more concise, front and back, that leads you through the process and makes a very handy desk reference. But besides using those tools to teach yourself, we have an entire development center that explains how to use R Markdown and how to use its features in depth. That development center is at rmarkdown.rstudio.com. We could go there right now very quickly. And you'll see it'll walk you through the basics of R Markdown. These are the sort of things we did at the beginning. And then, there's all sorts of pages in here that cover all sorts of things. If you were to print everything out, it'd probably be about 60 pages. That's how much it was last time I did it. There's an entire page under Developer dedicated to using parameters, passing in different types of data to the parameters and using them in your documents. And then another page that's dedicated to creating those document templates. There's the Journal Statistical Software template I just showed you. And you can learn here how to create your own templates. We've even added articles that people in the community have written that explain different things, like how to style Word documents that you generate with R Markdown and how to do some meta coding things with R Markdown. So now it's getting near the top of the hour, and I want to make sure I save at least 10 minutes for questions. And we can also stick around a little later if there's demand for it. So what I'm going to do is I'll start with the questions pane and see if there's any unanswered questions here. And then Bill, if you have any questions or have heard any questions, feel free to add them.
Thanks, Garrett. One of the questions that I thought would be helpful is if you could maybe jump over to HTML widgets and show some of that for the interactive.
Yeah, sure. So I don't know what the question is, but I imagine something like, how could you add interactions to R Markdown?
Exactly.
R Markdown documents, a very important thing to keep in mind with R Markdown documents is they're just a vehicle for delivering R code. So anything you could do with R code, you could put into an R Markdown document. I mean, that means you could connect to a database because you could do that with R and use that database in your document. And in this case, you could add interactive visualizations into your documents. HTML widgets is a framework for combining R packages with JavaScript visualization libraries. There's a lot of very interesting interactive visualization libraries written in JavaScript. And instead of reinventing the wheels in R developer, you can just marry the JavaScript visualization to an R package, which some pioneers have done. And if you're like me and you don't really work with JavaScript, you could use any of these packages that are based on HTML widgets to create an interactive graphic here. So this is a graphic. It's made with the code you see up here. So this is the digraphs library. Let me copy and paste this code. If I came over to RStudio and ran this code at the command line, it would work. It creates this interactive visualization that I could use. I could zoom in on the point of this time series. I could zoom back out down here. Read off values as I hover around in it. And if I went to my, R Markdown document, add a code chunk. If I paste all that code into the chunk, since R Markdown can do whatever R can do, it could host that interactive visualization right in the R Markdown document. So here's my, interactive visualization here. Now, one thing to keep in mind with these is they're JavaScript based. So your output either needs to be an HTML document or an HTML slideshow if you want it to work. That's just because a PDF doesn't run JavaScript, and neither does a Word document, at least not in a simple fashion. So as long as you stick to HTML, you could add JavaScript-based interactive visualizations into your documents fairly easily. This website here is just htmlwidgets.org. I went to the showcase. You could get a sense of some of the different packages that are in there. You could plot geospatial data on the sort of map that you're accustomed to see online. We looked at time series. We have some interactive scatter plots, although this is such a horrible example of it. We have network graphs that you could read off values and rearrange. Interactive heat maps. Interactive tables, a great way to display a lot of data concisely. You could search through it. You could choose which portions you look at. Three-dimensional scatter plots. And diagrams that you generate programmatically. So if you do any of those things, come here, take a look at the package that does it, and you can have access to those right out of the box, and you can put them in your R Markdown documents to make an interactive report. And then also, if you work with Shiny, you could add Shiny components to an R Markdown document. We call them interactive documents, but there's just a few changes you need to make to let R Markdown know that you have Shiny components, and it will basically turn your document into a Shiny app. And for those of you who don't know, Shiny is a framework for making R analysis interactive. It's basically a package that lets you create applications using R, and you could use it to make your R Markdown document an application. You could check out this page if you want to learn more about that. All right, so let's look at another question. I don't use PDF only because I keep getting an error that I don't have LaTeX installed. So you do need to have LaTeX installed to generate PDFs. R Markdown is going to look for LaTeX on your computer. LaTeX is free to install, but it is a very large install. I think it's about 2 gigabytes. You could look at latex-project.org to find out how to install it if you decide you want to do that. If you don't install LaTeX, you could use HTML and Word and all the other formats. You just need LaTeX for the PDF-based output. Is there a way to auto-generate an appendix of code chunks and related headings? How can I do this? I'm not sure. That does sound reasonable. It does sound likely that there is a way. I'm not going to be able to answer that authoritatively, though. Is there a place for shortcuts to the syntax? You can create keyboard shortcuts that do a variety of things in RStudio. To the first thing you should know about is there are many keyboard shortcuts in RStudio. And if you go to Tools in the newest version, Keyboard Shortcuts Help, you can look at those shortcuts. There's even more than you see here. Oh, no, sorry. This is going to be, okay. And then you could go to Modify Keyboard Shortcuts and create your own keyboard shortcuts from whatever combinations you like. If you want to have a shortcut for adding text into your document, something like when you click the insert code chunk, then what you can do in the newest release of RStudio is create a code snippet. I think project options. No, code editing. Not project options. This is one of the newest features, so I haven't done it too many times, so it's not really burned into my memory. But yeah, code snippets. You could edit a snippet. All of these things you see here are options. If you type this piece of text, lib, in the window, then RStudio will give you the option of adding in this text here. Probably a more useful one is fun. If you look at this text closely down here, you'll see this is a function definition in R. If you type in the snippet fun in an R script, let's close this for a second. Okay, please leave. The first option under tab completion is the snippet. And if I select it, I get this, and it says, okay, I'm going to help you write a function, choose a name, choose some variables go in the function, and this function can return x plus 1. There's a variety of snippets under global options code, edit snippets. You could see the ones that exist. In fact, it's worth going back to. You could see that there's snippets for the R language. There's also plenty of snippets for common tasks that you do in C++, Markdown, which might be relevant to us. Other things, Python, all these languages here. And if you wanted to make a new code snippet, you could right here, create a new one. So let's make a snippet called foo that says, I don't know, hello world. You could define snippets for anything you find useful and save them, and then they'll be around. I'm not going to create that. That might be a bad idea. Next unanswered question. I've seen some people put quotes around the library names when calling library. Is it good practice to do that? I don't know. It works if you don't do that. It does make it more consistent with install.packages where you have to put quotes around the name, so perhaps that's a reason. Consistency is always a good reason to practice something, but I didn't learn it that way and I never do that. And I haven't had any problems. Usually I have a separate directory for my source code and a separate directory for my outputs. How do I get it so I can click knit.html and have it dump the output into the output folder instead of the folder where the .rmd file is? I know I can manually run the render command. You can do it with the render command. You can specify the output file. That's what I would have recommended doing. I don't know if there's a way to reprogram RStudio's GUI to do what you want it to do in that aspect. I suspect maybe not. But if you follow up with RStudio help, those guys can help you a little more closely. I'm involved in writing R code and not so much in the code that controls the GUI. An interesting thing, HTML reports out of R Markdown, but where interactive plots or data flows can be functional, at least partially, and HTML files can be used independently or other software just HTML. With the HTML widgets I showed you earlier, those are self-contained JavaScript interactive visualizations. So if you use those, your HTML file will be self-contained and you can pass it on to somebody. If you set up your R Markdown document to be a Shiny app, then Shiny is much more versatile than HTML widgets. It's basically a way to write anything you want, whereas HTML widgets, they just do what they do. Shiny R Markdown documents will not be self-contained because Shiny applications, the way they function is there's an open R session that runs the code that your user asks through their keystrokes or their mouse clicks. It doesn't work any differently with an R Markdown document, which means it's not self-contained. You need to host it on a server like a Shiny server. So if you want to be self-contained, try to do it with HTML widgets. Otherwise, set up a server or use shinyapps.io to power it with Shiny. Which version of RStudio is this? Mine is 3.2. Well, this is the internal development version we're using, so it has the features of the last release, and there might be some more features in here that you'll notice. And when you come back and look at this webinar in 3 months, all of this stuff will be in the regular version. Do you use R Markdown at the end only for reporting, or do you use it as well as part of your workflow as you go along and test and try things? Any good practice to remember what you did and didn't do, and even to collaborate? I started using R well before there was such a thing as R Markdown. So I tend to write in an R script and try out lots of things I don't end up keeping anyways. I could do that inside of an R Markdown document. I haven't personally started doing that yet, but once I do have code that works, once I'm through my exploration phase, I do document that code in an R Markdown document or a .rmd file. As far as collaboration, we're working on some tools that will make that very easy to do. In the meantime, you can put your R Markdown file on GitHub. There's a Git integration with RStudio. If you, perhaps this may not be obvious, but if you start a new project, file a new project, yeah, I guess I'll say selected, new directory, empty project. You could initialize as a Git repository, which makes it very easy to share on Git. I'll create a project just so we can see it. And once you have that, once you've initialized as a Git repository, or if you make a project in a directory that is already a Git repository, you'll have this Git tab here, which makes it very easy to, you could take a look at a file and see what's changed in it. This is a brand new file since I just made this project. Everything's new. This is what the diff's telling me. If I wanted to, I could stage this for a commit. It's staged because it's checked here. I could say, I'm adding my .gitignore file. So it's an integrated GUI to Git in the RStudio IDE, and then I could commit this and say, okay, that's committed. Once I set up the remote, which you would do if you were working in a directory you cloned from GitHub, you could push and pull from inside RStudio as well. So what I like about R Markdown is you could just maintain the .rmd file on GitHub, and everyone can pull the changes from that and then generate their more sophisticated output, HTML or whatnot, from that .rmd file. You don't necessarily need to keep the output on GitHub as well, but you could. What is a YAML header? Will someone answer that? That's just the key value pairs you see at the top of your page. Can you use file names as parameters? Yes. I'm trying to say report for data sets and different files. For parameters, you could pass in things as character strings. That's the easiest to do. Or you could also tell RStudio or R Markdown, I suppose, what type of data they are, and they'll be treated that way inside of R. There's a short syntax for doing that. You could learn more about it at rmarkdown.rstudio.com. But if I were you and I wanted to work with file names, those just need to be character strings. And then I just pass those character strings as the first argument of read.csv or write.csv or whatever function uses the file name. Because normally file names in R are character strings. How to install additional templates. I'm just going to refer you to that page on rmarkdown.rstudio.com. What is metadata? By that I just mean data that's useful for rendering a report but doesn't actually appear in the report. So for example, I might want to know, what output format the report's going to appear in, but nowhere inside the report is it going to say the output format of this report is HTML. However, I would put HTML document in the YAML header, so that's why I call it metadata. Does R Markdown work well with creating packages? I wouldn't use R Markdown to create a package, but R Markdown is an excellent way to write package vignettes. So if you were going to create a package, there's a book, you may or may not know about it. It's online, it's free, it's called R Packages. You could get to it at this address, rpackagesHad.co.nz. You could buy a hard copy of the book from Amazon, or you could read it online here. It takes you through every step of the process of creating packages. You'll notice it's written by Hadley Wickham. the person who's probably created the most R packages ever. And he shares his best practices. He talks about creating vignettes in here, and this chapter will tell you how to use R Markdown to create vignettes. So that's the proper role for R Markdown creating packages, in my opinion. Can you show the datacamp slide from earlier in the presentation? What is datacamp? This video showing that slide. Yes, well, datacamp would be easier. Just go to the website, datacamp.com. They're a company that creates tutorials related to R. You could subscribe to them and get access to their tutorials. And they're similar to Code Academy or Code School, where when you take the tutorial, you watch some videos and you learn things. But when it comes time to practice, you practice by writing code directly into your web browser, and then you get immediate feedback about whether you did it correctly or not so correctly. And our studio is teamed up to make a track of R package-related courses in DataCamp. The video that I mentioned is called Introduction to Data Science with R. That's available from O'Reilly Media. And it's about 8 hours of content that shows you how to do all the things that a statistician or data scientist would do with R, like visualize your data, manipulate it, wrangle it, model it. And you can look at the first few lessons for free, and then they do charge for a large portion of the course. What about tables, controlling the format of the marks, etc.? If I was going to put a table into an R Markdown document and the output was HTML based, I would use that DT package from HTML widgets. It's an interactive table and it's very concise and pretty. Otherwise, you could use the packages in R that exist to help you format tables with R, like Stargazer or Xtable, and there's a couple others. But I'd recommend starting with those two. Any thoughts on transitioning existing lengthy R scripts into R Markdown? Okay. I said that because I looked at the number of questions that are still here. Well, just start at the beginning, and if the script is written in an intuitive sequence, then you could probably write your text in there with it. I would break things up into separate R code chunks based on the options you want to apply to the code. If you have a bunch of code that just sets everything up, put it all in the same code chunk and put echo equals false on so no one sees that. But when you want to start showing code, you just separate it based on where you want text to appear in between the code and what sets the different options you want to apply to the code.
So we appreciate everybody's time, and please stay tuned. You'll see more webinars from us in the future. Thanks for joining.